quarantine line ran along the eastern edge of the settlement, marked by orange survey flags on short metal stakes, driven into the red dirt. Past those flags, the aid station. Past the aid station, the military checkpoint. Past the checkpoint, nothing or nothing that mattered anyway. Just the scrubland, and the wind and the distant mountains that changed color from gray to violet, depending on the hour. I had been standing at the intake table for 11 hours the time she came through. My name is Dara Voss. I have been a field medic for 22 years. And in that time I have worked in 4 conflict zones, 2 plague corridors, and 1 very memorable flooding event on a moon I try not to think about anymore. I am not by any reasonable measure a sentimental person. Ask the people who know me. Ask my former commanding officer, Colonel Hesse Brandt, who once described my bedside manner as clinically adequate. Ask the refugee intake coordinator, Piotr Sulim, who that morning had asked me to please stop making the children cry by explaining their injuries. Honest medical terminology. I told him honest medical terminology was the only kind I knew. He went back to his table. I mention all of this because what happened that evening at the quarantine line is sometimes described by people who were not there as a passionate impulse, an act of instinctive human warmth, a story about a soft heart in a hard place. It was not that. What it was a clinical observation. I noticed something wrong, and I acted on it. The fact that the something wrong happened to be a person is incidental to the logic of the thing. Or that is what I told myself for the first several hours. By morning, I had revised my position considerably. The line that evening held perhaps 40 bodies, all of them waiting for the checkpoint soldiers to wave them through or wave them back. The settlement had been under modified quarantine for 9 days. The Veth fever, we were calling it that, though it had no official name yet, had arrived with the 3rd convoy and spread faster than anyone had expected. By day 4, it was in 2 of the dormitory blocks. By day 7, it was in the water distribution queue. The medical tent was running at 300% capacity, and I had not slept in a continuous block longer than 90 minutes in 4 days. Protocol was simple, as protocols in a crisis always are. Anyone showing symptoms was to be pulled from the general population, assessed, and held in the isolation ward until we could determine whether they were carrying the active pathogen or merely the early-stage markers that could go either way. The isolation ward was a second tent, erected 30 meters from the main one. It had 12 cots. We had put 26 people in it. The checkpoint soldiers were not medics. They were there to maintain order. In practice meant they stood at the flags with their rifles slung and their expressions carefully neutral, and they watched the line shuffle forward. They were by and large young. Their commanding officer was a man named Lieutenant Overek Dahl, who was approximately 24 years old and had the focused, slightly panicked energy of someone who understood that his decisions had weight but had not yet developed a comfortable relationship with that fact. I respected him more for the panic than I would have for false calm. He and I had an arrangement. He let me walk the line once an hour to do visual checks, and I let him believe he had negotiated that arrangement, rather than the other way around. I was on my 3rd walk of the evening when I saw her. She was perhaps 2/3 of the way back in the line. At first glance, there was nothing to distinguish her from the other Veth, the species that made up the majority of the displaced population in this particular settlement. Workers and small traders, and a handful of family groups, all of them wearing the same exhausted patience that long lines produce in any species. The Veth are a middling-sized people, humanoid in build, with skin that ranges from a pale gray-green to a deep slate, and faces that are wider across the upper register than the lower. Wide temples, wide brow ridge, a mouth that is somewhat small relative to human proportions. Their eyes are large and horizontally pupilled, very good in low light, and they tend to look at you from the side rather than dead on, which makes a direct Veth gaze feel oddly formal. Being addressed at a formal function, she was dressed in civilian clothes, a long-sleeved work garment in dark brown, trousers that were wrong for the season, 2 light, late summer boots worn in the autumn cold. I noted the boots and kept walking. Then something else snagged my attention and I stopped. She was holding her left side. Not obviously, not with both hands in a grimace. The way you hold a wound when you have been trained not to show it, or when you have spent enough time in circumstances where showing it would cost you more than hiding it. One arm at her side, elbow slightly bent, wrist turned inward so the forearm pressed naturally against her ribs. The pressure of a hand, pressed against a hand that was pressed against something that hurt. If you were not specifically looking for it, if you had not spent 22 years learning to read bodies the way other people read text, you would never have seen it. I went back to the intake table and picked up my assessment bag. "Where are you going?" Pewter asked. "Line check." "You just did a line check." "I'm doing another one." He made a noise that was not quite an argument and turned back to his intake forms. I made my way back to where she was standing, and I walked alongside her for a few steps as if I were checking someone else, someone 2 people forward. Then I stopped and looked at her directly. She looked back at me from a slight sideways angle, the way her species did, and her face was composed and careful. "How long have you been in line?" I asked. 2 hours, she said. Her standard was good. A slight flattening on the consonants that placed her from the western districts, but good. "Are you experiencing any symptoms of the fever? Elevated temperature, joint pain, sensitivity to?" "No," she said. "Where are you traveling from?" "The Kurith transit point." The transit point was 6 days' walk across rough terrain. "You walked from Kurith?" "Part of the way. The convoy dropped us at the Myrith Junction." I nodded and looked at her arm. She had not moved it. "You're injured," I said. "I'm fine." "You're pressing your elbow against your ribs and your wrist is angled in. You've been trained to hide it, or you've had to hide it for a long time. Either way, you're injured, and I'm the camp medic. And the proper thing is for you to let me assess you." She looked at me fully then, a direct Veth gaze, both eyes on me, which, as I said, feels almost ceremonial. For a moment she didn't move. Then she said very quietly, "If you take me out of the line, will they let me back in?" I understood the question. "I'll bring you through the checkpoint myself when we're done." Another pause. She was deciding something. You could see it in the stillness. Not a passive stillness, but an active one, the kind that precedes a significant choice. Then she nodded. "Once, and I led her out of the line toward the medical tent. Her name was Cirith. She gave it to me in the intake bay, along with her settlement registration number, which I wrote down and then lost almost immediately in the general chaos of the evening. It would not become relevant again until much later. The wound was a knife wound, moderately deep, on the left lateral torso, below the ribs. She had packed it herself with folded fabric from what had once been a sleeve. The left sleeve of her work garment had been cut off at the shoulder, and I could see the careful way she'd doubled the material and pressed it against the entry point. Bleeding had largely stopped, but the packing was dirty. She needed cleaning, antibiotic application, proper closure, and monitoring for any sign of internal involvement. "Lie back," I told her. She lay back. I began removing the improvised packing. "How did this happen?" I asked. "Road accident," she said. "That's not a road accident wound." "I know," she said. "I didn't think you'd believe me." "Then why say it?" A pause. "Habit." I worked in silence for a while. The tent was busy. 3 other medics were rotating through the beds, and the sounds of the ward were the usual sounds. The hiss of ventilation, low voices, occasional coughing that came from the isolation side. I had a privacy curtain drawn around our bay, partly standard procedure, partly because I had noticed the way she'd glanced at the checkpoint soldiers through the tent entrance, and I wanted to give her room to breathe. "The wound is clean," I said. "Whoever did this used a sharp blade, and you've kept the packing pressed well. No sign of deep tissue involvement. Begin to close it with adhesive strips and apply a broad-spectrum antibacterial sealant, and you'll need to stay still for at least an hour to let the sealant set." "I need to get through the checkpoint tonight." "You'll get through the checkpoint tonight, after the sealant sets." She looked at the tent ceiling. "I worked. You're very certain," she said after a while. "About the treatment plan? About everything. The way you talk to people. You sound certain. I'm certain about what I know. Wound assessment, treatment protocols, quarantine procedures. Everything else I'm making up as I go, like everyone else." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. The Veth facial vocabulary for amusement is slightly different from human one. A relaxation around the upper eye ridge more than anything at the mouth. but something that read as amusement. That is also a kind of certainty, she said. I finished the closure strips and began applying the sealant. It went on clear and cooled slightly on contact. She made no sound when I applied it, even over the wound edge, suggested either high pain tolerance or something else about her physiology that I filed away to think about later. We were quiet for a while. Outside, the checkpoint line was still moving. I could hear Piotr's voice at the intake table, the measured cadence of intake questions. The fever, Cyrith said. How bad is it? Bad, enough. We're containing it. Are you? I paused. The honest answer was, we were trying. The honest answer was that our isolation ward was over capacity and our antibiotic supply was running low, and the fever's mechanism was not something any of us fully understood yet. We're working on it, I said. She turned her head and looked at me, that direct gaze again. There are 1,200 people in this settlement, she said, approximately. And the fever is in the water distribution queue. I looked at her. Do you know that? I spoke to someone at the gate this morning, before I joined the line. She paused. I have been near fever corridors before, in the eastern settlements. 3 years ago. I set the sealant applicator down. You survived a Veth fever outbreak 3 years ago? Fever 3 years ago was different, a different strain, but similar pattern. Water pathway transmission, escalation in dense populations, and then, she stopped. And then what? She was quiet for a moment. The tent sounds moved around us. Somewhere on the other side of the curtain, one of the other medics was talking a patient through a procedure in a low, steady voice. Cyrith, I said. I need to think about whether to tell you something, she said. It is not a small thing to tell. I am a field medic. I have learned, over 22 years, to let silence sit when it needs to. I picked up the sealant applicator and put it in the cleaning tray, and I waited. She looked at the tent ceiling for a long time. Then she said softly, so softly, I leaned in slightly to be sure I was hearing correctly, human. I'm no ordinary alien. The words landed with a specific weight, not dramatic, not performed. The weight of something that had been carried a long time and set down carefully. I looked at her. Go on, I said. What she told me. Over the next 40 minutes, I will try to reconstruct accurately. Some of it I understood immediately. Some of it I did not fully understand until later that night, when events made the theoretical concrete. She was Veth, yes. She was not, or not only, what the ordinary classification of Veth meant. There is a lineage among the Veth, very old, that does not appear in any of the standard xenobiological texts I had trained with. Most Veth don't know it exists, or know only fragments of it as folk belief, as story. The lineage is called, in the Veth language, something that translates approximately as, the ones who carry the balance. I am going to call them the keepers, because that is what she called them in standard. A keeper is born, not made. The biology involved is subtle, and has nothing to do with the Veth concepts of royalty or hierarchy. Cyrith was very clear on this, and I believed her, because she said it with mild irritation at the very concept, the irritation of someone who has had to make this clarification many times. It is not lineage in the dynastic sense. It is something more like, she paused here looking for the word, a biological function, a role. Like how certain cells in a body carry oxygen, not because they chose it but because that is what they are made to do. What a keeper carries, in simplified terms that I am sure do not do justice to the actual complexity, is a living colony of microorganisms. Symbiotic, resident in the secondary lymphatic system, invisible to standard diagnostic scans because they are designed, evolved, thousands of years of Veth history, to be invisible. The colony is not harmful. It is in fact the opposite. It is an adaptive immune archive. Every pathogen a keeper encounters, or that has been encountered by the lineage going back many generations, is catalogued in the colony, not memorized in the way that ordinary adaptive immunity works, but actively encoded, with countermeasures. Keeper's body produces these countermeasures passively, in trace amounts, through ordinary biological processes, through breath, the proximity of skin, through certain glandular secretions that disperse in the air around them. In a confined space over time, a keeper's presence raises the baseline immune competence of the surrounding population. This is why the Eastern settlement 3 years ago did not collapse under its fever outbreak. Not because of the medical intervention, which had been late and inadequate, she said. without any particular criticism in her voice, just as information. But because there had been a keeper in the settlement, she had been there. She had been 19 years old, working a warehouse job, and she had not known what she was yet. She knew only that the people around her seemed to recover faster than the mortality curves predicted, that the fever burned through the settlement and left more survivors than it should have. She had filed this away and thought about it for 3 years. And she had found, eventually, an old woman in the western districts who knew what the old stories meant. That was when the trouble started. The people who had come after her. The people from whom she was running, whose knife had opened her left side below the ribs, were not interested in her as a healer. They were interested in her as a resource, a biological resource that could be extracted, contained, and sold or weaponized as the economics of the situation demanded. There are always such people. In any war, any crisis, any plague corridor, they appear with the certainty of a physical law. If there is something valuable and vulnerable, someone will try to own it. She had been running for 4 months. She had made it to the Karath transit point before one of them caught up with her, and she had left him with his knife and a problem of his own, and kept moving. The wound was a fair trade. I listened to all of this without speaking. When she finished, the tent was quieter. The evening rush had eased slightly, and the sounds from the checkpoint had dimmed. I sat on the stool beside her cot for a moment with my hands in my lap. Then I said, "The people who are after you, how close are they?" The one I dealt with was working alone. The others may know where I was heading. I don't know how quickly they communicate. How many others? 3 that I know of, perhaps more. I nodded slowly. "And the fever here," I said. "You think you can slow it?" "I think I already have," she said. "I arrived this morning. I have been in this settlement for 12 hours. She paused. "But slowly is not the same as stopping it. The colony works on contact proximity time. To meaningfully affect an outbreak of this density and this stage, I would need to stay through the population, be present in the high transmission areas, the water queue, the dormitories." Another pause. "The isolation ward." I looked at her. "Which is why," she said, "it would have been easier if you had not pulled me from the line." There was no reproach in it. She was simply describing mechanics. "You were going to walk through the checkpoint and into the settlement and just move around," I said. "Yes, without telling anyone what you were. Telling people creates problems. You can see this." I could see this. I sat with it for a moment. Outside the tent, the checkpoint soldiers were changing their shift. I could hear Lieutenant Dahl's voice, giving the handover briefing, his young serious voice carrying through the canvas. "The fever is worst in the isolation ward," I said. "We have 26 people in there. 7 of them are children." "I know," she said. She said it quietly, looking at the ceiling. "If I take you into the isolation ward tonight, Dahl's people will see us. There will be questions. Your registration will be flagged. The people following you run the checkpoint logs." "I know," she said again. We were quiet for a moment. "Sealant needs another 40 minutes to set," I said. "Yes. And then you'll need monitoring for the first several hours to watch for any sign. Packing suppressed an infection rather than clearing it. I would normally require a patient in your situation to stay in the ward overnight." She looked at me. Her expression was very still. "That would mean," I said carefully, "that you would be moving through the ward, between beds, because that is how monitoring works. A medic or a patient moves around." A long pause. "Yes," she said, "that is how it works. I would need to log you as a monitored patient. Name and registration number, which means anyone checking tonight's logs will see a monitored patient designated Cyrith from Karath, not a person of interest who bypassed the main checkpoint." She studied me with that direct gaze. "That is a specific log entry," she said. "Right, specific log entries. It's a professional habit." Something moved in her expression that was not quite the Veth equivalent of a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "You are certain," she said, "about what you know?" "I know wound management and I know how a monitoring log works," I said. "The rest I'm making up." I stood and went to tell Piotr that I had a patient requiring overnight observation. The next 8 hours were quiet in the way that the eye of a difficult event is quiet, not peaceful but suspended. Cyrith moved through the ward. I moved with her. Because that is what monitoring requires, a medic present with the patient. We went from bed to bed in the main ward, checking dressings, taking readings, adjusting the ventilation, the ordinary small work of a nighttime ward round. We went into the isolation section at 2 in the morning when the night shift was thin, and Dahl's current checkpoint team was focused on a delivery vehicle at the eastern gate. She walked slowly between the isolation cots, touched the bed rails with her left hand, the uninjured side, stood at the foot of each cot for a moment, breathing normally. In 7 of the cots there were children, some of them still awake in the way sick children are awake at 2 in the morning. Not alert, but not fully gone either, suspended in that feverish half-world. She stopped at each of them a little longer. I watched her, and I kept my log, and I did not speak more than was necessary. At one point she stopped at the cot of a young boy who was probably 8 or 9, running a high fever, his face flushed and sweated. She stood at the foot of his cot for a long moment. Then, she reached out and adjusted his blanket, which had slipped partially off his shoulder. Just that. The adjustment of a blanket. She looked at me. "Will he make it?" she asked. Her voice was very level, but the levelness was the kind that takes effort. "His fever has been spiking in the evenings," I said. "Tonight it hasn't spiked yet. It might not." She nodded and moved to the next cot. We finished the isolation section at 3:30 and came back to the main ward. I have been in a great many wards in 22 years. Civilian hospitals, military field stations, refugee aid centers, mobile trauma units. Each of them has its own particular texture of sound and smell, the specific mixture of antiseptic and human biology, the particular acoustic quality of a space where people are resting badly, the way ventilation sounds change depending on how many people are breathing, and how hard. Learn to read a ward the way you learn to read any environment. By accumulation, by attention, by the slow building of a baseline so that variations register as signal rather than noise. The medical tent that night felt different from how it had felt on the 9 previous nights. I noticed it coming back in from the isolation section. Something had shifted in the ambient. Not dramatically, not in a way I could have written into a report, but there was a quality to the quiet that was less taut than it had been. A resting quality rather than a surviving quality. I swear that this sounds like the kind of observation that should not appear in a clinical context, and I am reporting it anyway because it is what I observed. 2 patients in the main ward were awake when we came through. A Veth man in his 50s, with a secondary infection that had been our greatest concern the previous day, and a young woman, human, who had arrived 3 days ago in the second worst condition I had seen in this outbreak. Both of them looked up when we passed. The man nodded at me, which was not unusual. The woman looked at Sirith, and something in her face went from a kind of tightly held endurance to something softer. She didn't say anything. Sirith looked back at her and gave a small inclination of the head, a Veth gesture I had seen used between adults who were acknowledging each other across a shared difficulty. The woman exhaled and closed her eyes, and I thought she might actually sleep. I made a cup of tea from the portable unit near the supply table and sat down. After a moment, Sirith sat on the stool across from me. The tent was dim, and the ventilators breathed, and outside, there was nothing but the quiet of the settlement at night. The far-off generator hum. "Tell me about the old woman," I said. "The one in the western districts who knew the stories." Sirith looked at her hands. She had long fingers, the Veth proportions. Not elongated unnaturally, just slightly longer than the human scale, and the joints more articulated, so the hands seemed to have an extra degree of expressiveness when she moved them. She was not moving them now. "Her name was Verith," she said. "She was very old. She told me the stories, and she told me what they meant, and then she told me to run, because there were people who would know what I was if they heard I was asking about the old stories. She was right. I didn't run fast enough. Is she now? She died last winter." A pause. "Of ordinary old age." She was very old. "Were there others? Other keepers that you know of?" She named 2. Both dead. One from the fever in the eastern settlements, which she said was not an accident, because there are people who benefit from a population that cannot be stabilized, populations that can be cleared and resettled, and the land rededicated to resource extraction. The tone was not bitter. It was flat, informational, the way someone describes a physical law that they find distasteful but cannot argue with. The other she named had been found and acquired. I don't know what happened to that one. I turned my teacup in my hands. What happens to you, I said, if they acquire you? They want the colony. They think it can be isolated, cultured, weaponized as a fast immunity agent for sale to military customers, or as a control agent. Something that can be introduced to a population selectively, to provide immunity only to those who have paid for it. She paused. The problem is that the colony is symbiotic. It cannot survive outside a living keeper for more than a few hours. So the only way to maintain a viable supply of colony material would be to... She stopped. To maintain a viable keeper, I said. Yes. I set my tea down. You'd be a biological factory. Indefinitely, she said. Yes, we sat with that for a moment. Well, I said, that's not going to happen. She looked at me. That direct gaze, the formal weight of it. You said that as if you can prevent it. I said it because I can prevent it. I have resources you don't have. I have a tent full of patients. Gives me a legitimate reason to control access to this space. I have a documented patient under my medical supervision with a knife wound and fever exposure risk. I have Lieutenant Dahl, who is 24 years old and has the slightly panicked energy of someone who takes his responsibility seriously. And I have been very careful to give him nothing to be suspicious about and everything to be grateful for. 9 days running. I paused, and I have a medical log that tonight says exactly what I want it to say. Cyrith was very still. You are making up a great deal right now, she said. A fair amount, I agreed. But the core is solid. Something happened in her expression then. I am not sure I have a precise word for it. It was not quite relief. Relief is too simple, too like a loosening. This was more like someone who has been braced against a door for a very long time, feeling the pressure ease, not abandoning the door, just, slightly carefully being allowed to breathe. Go to sleep for a few hours, I told her. You're a monitored patient. You're supposed to rest. About you. I have a ward to run. I stood, picked up my assessment bag. I'll check on you in 90 minutes. She lay back on the monitoring cot, and I went back to work. The morning began at 5, which is always when mornings begin in a medical tent, regardless of what the sun is doing. The isolation ward stirred, patients coughing and shifting, the early morning clinical assessments beginning. I sent Rekha, my best night shift medic, into the isolation section to do the first morning readings, and I stood at the edge of the main ward with my coffee and watched the daylight come through the tent panels. At 5:45, Rekha came out of the isolation section with a look on her face that I had not seen on her face in 9 days. Boss, she said. Come look at this. I followed her in. The fever readings were down. Not all the way down, not cured, nothing so dramatic. But across the ward, the morning temperatures were lower than the previous morning's low. The boy with the evening spikes was sleeping deeply, and his forehead was cool, under my hand. The two adults who had been in serious condition were sitting up, one of them asking for water with a focus in her eyes that had not been there yesterday. Rekha looked at me. What changed? I had a monitored patient making rounds last night, I said. Sometimes having a presence in the ward helps. People feel less alone. Rekha gave me the look she reserves for explanations that are technically not false, but are obviously incomplete. She has a very good look for this. I've spent 9 days admiring it. She said and went back to her assessments. I went to check on Cyrith. She was awake, sitting on the edge of the monitoring cot, which was my first indication that she was not going to stay quietly in place for the rest of the day. She had that particular alertness of someone who has slept a few hours and woken with their mind already running. The readings are down, I told her. I know. I checked before you woke up. I sat down across from her. You need at least another 12 hours for any significant immune bacilline effect to register across the full population density. The dormitories haven't had coverage. The water queue. I know, she said. I have been thinking about that. And I have been thinking, I said, about the checkpoint logs. And the fact that anyone who comes looking for your registration will pull last night's entry and see a Kurth transit patient under medical observation, which buys us perhaps 24 hours before they start asking harder questions. And in those 24 hours, I need to get you moved into the settlement proper in a way that is documented as a routine discharge and not a disappearance. She looked at me steadily. I have a colleague, I said, a housing coordinator named Tem Vasek. She is not an exciting person, but she is reliable, and she owes me a significant favor from the second week of this posting, the details of which are not important. She can get you a billet assignment in one of the central dormitory blocks, which is also where the fever is. Worst, which is useful for your purposes. And that assignment will be logged as a routine placement 3 days ago, backdated to your arrival, because Tem is very good with administrative records when she needs to be. Cyrith stared at me. You have been planning this since last night, she said. I have been planning this since approximately 2:15 in the morning, I said. I find administrative thinking calms me when I can't sleep. A pause then, people following me are looking for someone who came through the main checkpoint and vanished from the medical logs. They will not be looking for someone with a 3-day-old legitimate housing record who is living in dormitory block C. I paused. They may also find that the checkpoint soldiers have been given a revised description of a person of interest, an older male Veth, broad-shouldered, Eastern District accent. Because there is someone matching that description in the checkpoint area right now who is entirely innocent of anything, but has been loitering in a way that Lieutenant Dahl will find worth investigating. That investigation will occupy approximately 4 to 6 hours of his attention and the attention of the people he communicates with. Cyrith was very quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "Are you going to tell me you are certain about all of this?" "I'm certain about the parts I know," I said. "The rest is an educated estimate based on 22 years of operating in situations where the official procedures are inadequate and improvisation is required." She looked at me for a long time. "You don't know me," she said. "You don't know if any of what I told you is true. I could be. I know wound management," I said. "Shh. I know what a wound looks like when someone is running. I know what a face looks like when someone is the truth about something that cost them a great deal to tell. I know what an isolation ward looks like when something has changed overnight, and the thing that changed is a person who, through it." I paused. "I am a field medic, Cyrith. Reading bodies is my entire professional competency." The tent was quiet around us. Outside, the settlement was waking up. Voices, the clatter of the breakfast distribution, someone's child calling a name. She exhaled slowly. And then she said something I was not prepared for, in a register I had not heard from her before. Not flat, not careful, something underneath the composure that was unprotected. "I have been running for 4 months, she said. I stopped once, in the second week, in a way station near the Veth provincial border, because a family there had a sick infant, and I couldn't keep walking. I stayed 3 days. The infant recovered." She paused. "And then I had to leave before they could ask too many questions, because staying creates risk. So I left." Voice was steady, but the words had weight. "I have not stopped since then." I looked at her. "You can stop now," I said, "as long as it takes." She looked at her hands. "And when it's done," she said, "when the fever is controlled and I have to move on, because I will have to move on, then you'll move on with a full set of legitimate transit, documents, a health clearance from a certified field medic, and a letter of good character from the camp medical director." I paused. "It is also me. I wear several hats." She looked up. "You can do that?" "I can do that." A silence. Long and specific. The silence of someone revising a calculation they have been running for a very long time. "Why?" she said. It was a genuine question. Not suspicious. She was past suspicion, I thought, or past the kinds of suspicion that asks why as a challenge. She was asking as someone who genuinely does not understand and wants to. I thought about it for a moment. About the honest answer versus the tidy one. "I have been in 4 conflict zones and 2 plague corridors," I said. 1 very memorable flooding event. In all of those situations, the thing that determined outcomes was not the resources or the protocols or the military presence. It was whether people could be trusted to do the right thing when the right thing and the easy thing were not the same. I paused. "You walked 6 days from Kurith with a knife wound and you came through that checkpoint because 1,200 people in this settlement have a fever that you can help with. You were going to do it anonymously because you knew that telling the truth would complicate everything. That is not the behavior of someone I am going to let get acquired." Cyrith was very still. "That is not a small thing," she said at last. "What you're doing. No, I agreed. It's the correct thing. There's a difference. She almost smiled then. A proper one this time. Whatever the Veth equivalent is. The relaxation around the upper eye ridge. The slight softening of the set of the jaw. I had been learning the vocabulary of her expressions, and that one, I was fairly certain, meant something close to what a smile means. I will need at least 4 days in the dormitory blocks, she said. Perhaps 5. The water queue I can address quickly. If I can spend an hour at the distribution point, it will have a significant effect on the transmission pathway. I can arrange a reason for you to be at the water distribution point. We've been discussing a volunteer sanitation program. You've just volunteered. And the isolation ward. I should go back tonight. You're still a monitored patient with a documented wound. Coming back for a checkup is entirely appropriate. She nodded slowly. The planning mode was coming back into her face. That active stillness, the engagement with logistics, I recognized it. It was a mode I lived in. The people following me will not stop looking, she said. No, but they will be looking in the wrong places, for the wrong person. Using information that is 4 months old. And after 5 days, you will have transit documents describing someone who has been legally resident in this settlement for several weeks and is traveling to the northern distribution hub for medical transport coordination reasons. I paused. You'll need a cover occupation, something that explains mobility and presence in multiple locations. I have been thinking about that, she said. I did medical transport logistics in the eastern settlements 3 years ago. Before I knew what I was, I looked at her. Can you document that? No. The records from that period are in the Eastern Settlement Administrative Archive. Is currently under military hold because of the land rededication situation. That's inconvenient, I said. On the other hand, a medic with no verifiable prior record is a medic who can be credentialed fresh, which means I can write you a training completion certificate for the field sanitation program that we are going to run in this settlement starting tomorrow. You're going to run a field sanitation program starting tomorrow, she said. I have been meaning to run one for 2 weeks. You've given me the motivation. She studied me for a moment. Then she said, slowly, you are making up a great deal. Yes, I said, but it is logistically coherent, and coherent is what matters in an administrative crisis. I stood. I am going to go speak to Tem Vasic. I need you to stay in the monitoring cot until I come back and formally discharge you. Can you do that? Yes, and eat something. There's a food distribution at 6:30. I'll have someone bring you a tray. I don't need. You've been running for 4 months and you walked 6 days from Karath, I said. You need to eat. A pause. Yes, she said. All right. I left her there and went to find Tem Vasic. The next 4 days were work. Ordinary, extraordinary work. The kind that fills every hour and leaves nothing for reflection. Cyrith went into Dormitory Block C under the name and records Tem provided. She appeared at the water distribution queue as a volunteer sanitation observer each morning. She came back to the medical tent each evening and as a recovering patient for follow-up assessment, which gave her several hours in and around the ward and the isolation section. The fever curves turned. Not immediately. Not with the drama of a miracle. This is not that kind of story. The mortality projections had been grim. At the rate the fever was progressing, we expected to lose between 60 and 90 people before we achieved containment. What we lost was 11. 11 people, which is 11 too many, and I will not make that small. But the difference between 11 and 75 is not a statistic. It is 64 lives. Reka stopped asking me what had changed on the morning of the 3rd day. I think she understood, on some level, that there was something she was better off not knowing the details of, and that the outcomes were good, and that in a field environment, those two things sometimes coexist, and you learn to let them. Lieutenant Dahl's investigation of the broad-shouldered Veth at the checkpoint produced nothing useful. He apologized to the man, thoroughly and professionally, which I thought well of him for. He then spent several days trying to write a report that adequately described why the investigation had been initiated, which occupied him in a bureaucratic loop that I suspected would resolve itself only after Cyrith was long gone. The people following her did not appear at the settlement checkpoint. Whether they were working from wrong information or waiting at a point further along the likely travel route, or whether the checkpoint records had been sufficiently obscure to throw them, do not know. They did not appear. On the 5th evening, Sirith came to the medical tent for what would be her last follow-up assessment. The wound was healed cleanly. Veth tissue recovery is somewhat faster than human, and with proper closure and no infection, the lateral wound was already more scar than wound. She would have a mark there for years. She said she had been told scars were something the Veth considered evidence of having continued. I gave her the transit documents, the field sanitation training certificate, the letter of good character. I had written that letter 3 times before I was satisfied with it, because I kept wanting to write something that went beyond the professional endorsement it needed to be on the surface, and I kept pulling back from the personal, because the personal was not what she needed the letter to be. In the end it said, Sirith of Kurith Transit Point, Field Sanitation Volunteer Liar, has completed the Voss Settlement Medical Field Sanitation Program and demonstrated exceptional competency in population-level health assessment and intervention. She is recommended without reservation for any role requiring medical logistics, community health coordination, or sensitive population interface work. D. Voss, Field Medical Director. It was not a small endorsement. Anyone who knew what those qualifications meant in a medical transit context would understand that I was describing someone with a very specific and unusual skill set. It was coded, but not incoherently so. If someone who knew what to look for was reading it, they would know what it said. She read it standing at the supply table. She was quiet for a moment. This will open doors, she said. That's the idea. Not just in the short term. No, I said. Not just in the short term. She looked at me. You are giving me a career. I'm giving you documentation of skills you already have, I said. The career is yours. You were doing this work before you knew what you were. You'll keep doing it. She folded the documents carefully and put them in the inside pocket of her new jacket. She had replaced the cut-sleeved work garment on day 2 with help from the settlement clothing distribution. The new jacket was darker, better quality, with interior pockets. She had chosen it practically, but she wore it well. The boy, I said, in the isolation ward. Bed 7. He's recovering, she said. Checked this afternoon. His fever broke last night. I know. I wanted to tell you in case you hadn't heard. She looked at me steadily. I had heard, she said. I went and stood at the foot of his cot for a while because... She stopped. Because that's how it works, I said. Yes. We stood in the quiet tent for a moment. Where will you go? I asked. North first, she said, the Northern Distribution Hub, as the documents say. There is another settlement there, a large one, that has been having fever problems for 2 months. Uncontrolled. Officially, it is classified as an acceptable loss scenario. She said this without particular expression, which was its own kind of expression. I will not accept that. No, I said. I wouldn't either. She paused. I don't know. I have been running so long that forward planning beyond the immediate situation is a skill I seem to have lost. It comes back, I said. Give it time. She put out her hand. The Veth equivalent of a handshake is not quite the same gesture. The palm is angled differently, is lighter. It is more of a touching of wrists than a gripping of hands. But she had adapted to the human version at some point and offered it clearly, and I shook it. Her grip was firm and not brief. Thank you, she said. Come back through if you're ever in the corridor, I said. I'll be here for at least another 4 months. I know, she said. I checked the posting schedules. Something in her expression that was the Veth equivalent of a smile. You said certainty is a kind of comfort. I wanted to know where the certain things were. She left at 6 the next morning in the northbound convoy, with a legitimate berth and legitimate papers, and a letter that would open doors. I watched the convoy until the dust settled. Then I went back to the intake table. Piotr looked up from his forms. Patient discharged? Patient discharged, I said. Fever numbers this morning are the best we've seen since day 1, he said. Whatever you changed in the ward protocol, keep doing it. I will, I said. I poured a coffee and sat down and looked at the morning intake queue, which was shorter than it had been in 9 days. And I thought about a woman walking 6 days from Karath with a wound in her side because 1,200 strangers needed her, telling nobody and asking nothing and doing the work anyway. The numbers that week told a story. 11 dead instead of 75. Fever that had been accelerating stopped. 26 people in an isolation ward, most of them walking by the end of the week. That week also told another story, in the negative space between what happened and what the projections said should have happened. 64 lives in that negative space, including a boy in bed 7 whose fever had broken in the night. I wrote the final containment report 2 weeks later, when we were officially cleared. It cited improved water sanitation protocols, a revised isolation procedure, and the implementation of a new volunteer community health monitoring program. All of that was true. None of it was complete. Some true things don't fit in a report. Some true things travel in convoy documents and field sanitation certificates and carefully worded letters of recommendation. Some true things walk north towards settlements where the fever hasn't broken yet, carrying what they are in their secondary lymphatic system, doing the work that needs, doing the quiet way that work gets done when nobody is watching. I have thought about her often in the time since. In the work I've done, 2 more postings, a different plague corridor, the flooding event I still don't like to talk about. I think about what she said about carrying something that was not a choice. That simply was what she was made to be. I have thought about whether there is a human equivalent of that, and whether the thing I have spent 22 years doing, showing up and reading bodies and making the right call when the right call is hard, is something I was made to be, or something I chose. I think the honest answer is that the distinction may not matter as much as I once believed. The boy in bed 7 would be 12 or 13 now. He'll be growing into that specific, slightly bewildered phase where a child who was very sick once begins to understand what that meant and why people look at them sometimes with a particular quietness. I hope he knows, in whatever way he can know it, that someone came a long way and worked hard and didn't ask for anything to make sure that he got to grow into that phase. I don't know where Cyrith is. The northern distribution hub was cleared of fever 6 weeks after she should have arrived there, ahead of schedule, by methods the official report attributed to an enhanced community sanitation volunteer program, and a fortunate shift in seasonal transmission patterns. I read that report and I thought, yes, I imagine that's exactly right. Some true things travel quietly. Some certain things hold, even when you can't see them.